Without further ado, we're going to do a deep dive into Half Moon Bay history and some notable families with the Half Moon Bay History Association president, nonetheless, Dave Cresson.
I forgot the last time that I was in front of this group, I forgot to open my remarks, not just by saying welcome, but by saying some gigantic, humongous thank you, docent team, for volunteering to put in this work. Mainly I'm talking about being a docent, to become sort of the friendly voice of the History Association, to share history and share stories with visitors and locals alike. You guys are such champions. It's a just humongous thank you from me. I forgot to say it last time, so I'll say it twice. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to yet another chapter in this. The last time that we were here together, my topic was an overview of the history of the Coastside. Well, the themes, this one is a history of downtown Half Moon Bay. And it probably does deserve a special chapter, but you can imagine that the flow of events that make up the history of California, as well as the Coastside, as well as Half Moon Bay, the flow of events are all the same. Now, I know in this room that we have people that are real deep experts in details that in some areas probably exceed mine, and I should be picking your brain. In other areas, maybe I can add a dollop or two. But other people in this room, I'm guessing, this is sort of new to. And because I'm doing both of these sort of broad landscape overviews, I thought it would be a good idea for me to call it a handout. But if you can pin this down, this is Coastside history. If you can pin these landmarks, these milestones, these turning points, if you will, if you can get these into your heads, you really don't need much more to start other than a smiling, friendly face and somebody that loves to talk to people. And everybody in this room I know loves to talk to people. I know almost all of you well enough to know that. But I thought getting these basic chapters into your minds and into your notebook, then you can go from there and build to your heart's content. You can drill as deeply as you want. So I'll pass these out. Today's talk says, and the people of downtown Half Moon Bay. Are all of you familiar with this book? What a wonderful gift it was. The reason I'm waving the book around is because the forte of this book is that it does genealogies of the old families of Half Moon Bay. And that doesn't mean that they're famous people and town fathers, although some are. It just means that if you want a sense of the fabric of this town, this is a great book to own. And in the process of familiarizing yourself with that mainstream story, this book has 1,001 wonderful photographs of the Coastside, and it has streams of history flowing through it. So it's a wonderful resource book. I'm going to hold this up because that outline that I gave you really basically comes out of this book, which is a book that was written for the sole purpose of bringing all the other wonderful books that have been written about Coastside history under the covers of one. Now, my publisher doesn't allow me to give these away. I'll have to talk to him about whether he'd be willing to sell them at some huge discount. But honestly, when I say if you want to drill deeper into any of these, for the sake of braggadocio, we'll call it turning points. But these are the major phases of Coastside history.
What is the name of that book?
Turning Points.
Oh, Turning Points.
Actually, it's Half Moon Bay's Turning Points. It really means the Coastside, though.
Are you going to have some books available at the jail for people to buy?
I am
Ocean Shore
absolutely
Railroad
certain.
And this one?
If we can find the books, the Last Whistle has turned into something of a collector's
Well, that-
item in its last
But the Ocean Shore
printing.
Railroad, would be a great book to have there in your book.
Oh, that's something to talk to the museum manager about, but if she doesn't have books for sale, I'd be shocked, I tell you, love.
That, we're kind of going one thing at a time with this project right now, but some kind of gift shop is coming. It's in the back of my mind once we get it open.
So let's be on our way and launch our talk, which will go. The best way is to go in chronological order. But I've tried to design this talk to concentrate more on Half Moon Bay, what we now think of as Half Moon Bay, knowing that Half Moon Bay, that name in English, originally came from what we now call Pillar Point Harbor, but the earliest surveys of the coastside after this became part of the United States, that's where the name first showed up. But we're talking about the city today. We're going to go through the same chapters, except we're going to really narrow it in, and in each case I'm going to try to personalize it, to try to think of a champion, hopefully, that I have a picture of, because we're doing a presentation. It's nice if you're going to talk about people that have pictures, but we don't always have that. So in each of the chapters we'll touch on it quickly, but no story about Half Moon Bay or the coastside that I ever tell fail to begin with how pretty this coastside of ours is. And these are some of my favorite pictures. One was taken by a fellow named Michael Long. You probably know him. He himself is something of a coastside legend as a photographer, and we have lots of pretty fabulous photographers in this town, I'm proud to say. I think that other one was taken by me just on a casual hike, but it caught the spirit of Cresson Canyon. Oh yeah, I started to say, if you joined me last time with my PowerPoint, my computer has a mind of its own. Just let me know when it starts telling its own story, and we'll try to get it under control. So, I want to start today's talk, of course. You see? Nice start. There it goes. I want to start today's story by talking about the natives, because the natives were here, right here in Half Moon Bay, and you've heard everything that you could possibly want to hear about the cultures and the ways of the lifeways, as he calls it, of the Native Americas from Dr. Mark Helfer. What a wonderful presentation he gives. But we'll just, for these purposes, focus on Half Moon Bay and say that if you remember, the Ohlonies, which is how the tribe, it's a language group, it's not even a tribe, but that language group sprawls from Hayward and the East Bay all the way down to Monterey and sweeps up the peninsula here. And they all apparently, at least in the times when we got to know a little bit about them, they all spoke similar languages. They don't like to think of them as dialects, but of a same language. But for simplicity's sake and for historical and cultural purposes, as you heard from Mark, refer to them as a whole as Ohlonies, the Spanish, of course, as Coastanoans. And the little footnote that I put off to the side is to say that for Half Moon Bay, there was a tribe that was called the Chiguan tribe, and that's their language. The Chiguan tribe consisted of 2 tribelets or villages, and it's still a matter, the people that are deeply invested in understanding the Native Americans here are continuing to study and sort through this. And on that point, when I did my writing about Half Moon Bay and the natives, I stated as a firm fact, because I had it on the best authority, and there's a lesson in this sentence that I'm saying, I had it as a firm fact that a group that called themselves Shakunama, golly, I love that word, Say it with me. Chatunama was the village that was right here on Pilarcitos Creek. And as you remember, they tend to wander back and forth up their own canyon. But the middens, there's a history question you might possibly be asked as a docent. Can somebody answer this question for me? What is a midden? No experts allowed. Maury.
The trashy.
That he called it, just in case you didn't hear that, his answer was, it's a trash heap. It's a garbage dump. By strict definition, that's what a midden is. But by native culture, it is a place where it actually becomes a burial ground, which makes it sacred in some cases. And it's actually a place where they put things ceremonially in other places. But strictly speaking, it's a garbage dump, and most of all, they always put their stuff in the same place. So archaeologists study the native cultures by going down the middens, and some of them have been as deep as 60 feet high. You'll remember Mark Felkema saying 60 feet. Can you imagine the number of years it takes of casting mostly shells and animal debris to make 60 foot high? No wonder that was taken when the Americans came along as ways to fertilize your front yard or improve drainage or stuff. In any event, there's a midden at the end of Pilarcitos Creek for the village which has been called Chatunamo, and then there's another village in the Cheguan tribe that didn't recognize our Half Moon Bay border. That's up by Pillar Point, and again, there are middens there. The location of middens are kept strict secrets because archaeologists and Native Americans feel that they have special importance, scientific importance, to be sure. They don't want people digging around in them, and it's disrespectful in the Ohloni's case to be digging around in them. And the reason that I put this up isn't just to say, oh, it's Chatunamo, as much fun as that is to say, or Chibunte in the case of Pillar Point. The reason I put this up is to say, if anybody says that you said something wrong, you've made a mistake, and they're a greater expert or feel they are, know something, the fact is, it's distinctly possible that they are. And in this case, nobody is 100% sure, and there are maps out that show those two communities in opposite places, which means research is being done, translations are being done, mainly from Mission Dolores records that have been, first of all, translated from Spanish, knowing that they're getting their information about the names of the tribes from natives. So you've got language, and you've got years of casual keeping. And this is a truism about the history stories that we all will be telling us. We'll say it this way today, and next week we may find that we made a mistake. And I say, don't be embarrassed, don't be humiliated, be open to correction. And when you've written a book that consists of more than 3 pages, you'll be corrected more than 3 times. So, I love this table here. Our natives crossed the line while they were here of being Middle Stone Age, which is 15,000 years ago, into the Neolithic, the modern Stone Age, and really just pushed the edges of that for our Ohloni's. And so these were really ancient people with ancient rites, ceremonies, beliefs, and cultures that they say were contacted by Spanish explorers. Well, it must have been a lot more than a contact for that experience when Stone Age people one day woke up and found basically what, even by our standards, they had guns, the Spanish did, so they were pretty well advanced. And that although no harm was intended, it was a catastrophic clash when those societies met. I put this picture up just because it's a really terrific picture of a typical Ohlone hut made out of reeds, and it allows me to fly past it pretty fast. And then the next picture, I said each chapter of this I'm going to put a person, because my topic is supposed to be about people. And anybody that saw Hilkeva's talk saw that picture. But I wanted to just pause for a moment on this, because when I'm asked, who are the important people, and show me the history of Half Moon Bay and the important people and the important families, I ask you, what does it take for a person to go down in history in a small town? And it's really a question to me. You know, farmers should go down in history. And the only names that we remember are the names of the very biggest ones, the ones that were on ranches that were hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of acres here. And that's not the Half Moon Bay story. Most of the farmers that were here were on reasonably small plots. I think they're called quarter sections, 160 acres. That's a pretty small farm, none of the Central Valley stuff. So what did they do? Well, we're going to be talking about some people whose names in Half Moon Bay and the Coastside went down in history. But it doesn't take much to have your name go down. If you're lucky enough to have a street named after you, if your name was Kelly, you know that's got to be an important person. Kelly, and so forth. Or if you happen to name your building after yourself, that makes you a famous person. But honestly, the people that built this community weren't all the famous people that had streets named after them, or had buildings named after them, or built things. Zavala had to wait hundreds of years for a building to be named after him. His building was just another old building, and it was named after the next owner for quite a number of years, a fellow by the name of Deneri. So the Zavala House, as it's called now, was called the Deneri House 50 years ago, and for the previous 50 years before that. So I just leave this question with you. Who is important here and why? And find your own answers in history as you dig through these various books, and pick out your favorites, as I have. I've got my heroes on the coast side. Maybe we'll touch on them. Anyway, I took this picture just to say there is I think maybe it's just that image doesn't like that. Oh, I know what it is. It's modest. That's why it wants to go away. But this thing, you remember when Mark talked about this, he pointed out that the earrings they wear aren't earrings for ornaments. They were tools that they sharpened their arrows with, the points of their arrows. And you'll notice that the quiver that this fellow's carrying his arrows in is a fox. So it's just the whole body of a fox with the quiver. So I chose that as just to say, let these native hunters be the one that we'll celebrate as important people for the natives. Now, in my opinion, though, we can go into a lot more depth when we go to explorers. We're going to talk about Drake because he discovered Drake's Bay and left that famous brass plaque up at. Come on, give me the name.
Is it
Point Reyes?
Point Reyes, thank you very much. So he left a brass plaque when he was here that says, "I dedicate this place that I've discovered to the royalty of England, and be it forever in their keeping." So he was the first one to claim California for anybody that I know of. But Mosquino is especially important because he's the first one that saw, and we've dwelt on this, so I just touch it to remind you because they are important. These are truly important names. Mosquino because in 1603 discovered a wonderful bay that would be a wonderful place for the Spaniards to locate a mission and to become a powerful harbor. and he made note of it, even named it after the Monterey was the viceroy that sent him along on that exploration trip, and gave such glowing reports on it that it's what caused later, 166 years later, for another party to go out and find Monterey by land. And that brings us to our local hero, and certainly the man we'll celebrate for the exploration part of this, de Portola, or Portola, as he's more commonly called, to come along. And Anza, of course, was the one that led Portola, if you'll allow me to do the quote marks, discovered San Francisco Bay and passed, as I love to fondly think, passed within a few hundred feet of where we're standing on his way through, and actually camped at Pilarcitos Creek in Half Moon Bay for a couple of days, and did some pretty interesting stuff. So I put these pictures here to celebrate that, because Portola really did become pretty celebrated, and he was the first European Anglo sort, not really Anglo, but Spanish, to make contact with the natives and cause the cataclysmic collision of cultures, which, to make a long story short, ended up with the near complete demise of the Ohlone, who had spent the previous 6,000 or so years here. So this is a picture of the Portola expedition. There, I could have cheated and looked at this, because Point Reyes is being highlighted here. You can't see it, but I can. It's written Point Reyes. This is when they discovered Point Reyes and thought, we've gone too far, because they knew that Point Reyes was carefully charted by Vizcaino, and they knew that's the place that was known as San Francisco. So they know I've passed Monterey. So this is the discovery from the ocean, probably from the top of Montara Mountain, looking north, and they saw Point Reyes. This is the moment where they crossed Sweeney Ridge in Pacifica and saw the incredible bay that so exceeded any possible naval discovery that Monterey Bay would, for obvious reasons, for which he got so famous. And there's de Portola and his Sunday go-to-meetings costume. So here we are, looking at the Portola campsites. I remind you, as I did the last time we spoke, that this map is a map that's being used for the Portola Trail Project. This will be, what is this, the 250th anniversary of the Portola exhibition will be next year, 2019. And so trails are being made, signage made, interpretations are being made, and so forth. So the gold star I put there to say, Portola was in Half Moon Bay. And to be specific, he was here on October 28th and 29th, and he returned on November 16th. So the big red star is to say, let's celebrate Portola as an important figure in Half Moon Bay history, because he came right by here. I'll take a moment with your patience to do, and I'll read this to you, so don't stress about this. That's there mainly so I can read to you. But the reason I picked this quote is because the Portola expedition was troubled with scurvy. And you think of scurvy as being a disease of seafarers, but scurvy is a disease of people that don't realize that you have to have vitamin C to survive, and it creates the most horrible symptoms. And it was at the end of, they've been on the trail for 6 months and not eating their oranges. They're eating their grain, and they're eating seafood, and they're eating animals as they encounter them, but they didn't know about all the places where you could get vitamin C. So they're feeling really badly, they're worn out, they're tired, they're wrecked, and worst of all, these symptoms that are covered in that last thing. But the point, which I'll read in just a second, but the point is, it was the natives, the friendly natives who supported them, different tribes all the way from San Diego to San Francisco, different tribes, held out a helping hand to this expedition, this foreign expedition, as they wended their way up the California coast. And when they came to Half Moon Bay, they're talking about how horrible they feel here. They've got all kinds of stomach problems and so forth. And they say, but here in Half Moon Bay, the change of season, the cessation of the northwest winds and the fogs, and the beginning of the land breezes, which blew after the rainy season, contributed to the same result, referring to the same result, relief and improvement of the sick. The swellings and the contraction of the limbs, which made the sick like cripples, disappeared little by little. At the same time, their pains left them and all the symptoms of scurvy disappeared. Their mouths became clean, their gums solid, and their teeth became firmly fixed in place. It was the natives giving them pinoli nuts, which are pine nuts, pino, pine nuts, which have, and probably other things with more vitamin C, but there is some vitamin C at least. It's the natives gave them the food, which was just to feed them, but little did they know it was also getting rid of their scurvy. So Anza went on to found Mission Dolores on June 29, 1776. Always fun to point out that June 29, 1776 is, do the math here, that's the last day of June. 5 days later, the highly civilized, not this frontier place where natives and explorers are just trying to survive and putting a shovel in the ground to start a mission in the furthest north place at that time, San Francisco. 5 days after that date for Mission Dolores is the day the Liberty Bell rang. And the 4th of July and Independence, much like two different worlds on opposite sides of the same continent. Just a quick touch on this. And this is the famous fellow that I thought would best represent the mission times. This is a typical mission soldier. He's a Mexican fellow. These were the ones that did the heavy lifting and were ready to do the heavy fighting to protect the Presidio in San Francisco and also protect the mission. So I thought, we'll describe him as a good representative of that mission time. But he's the one, they were the power, the lifting power and the riding power and the protective power that brought Portola and Anza up the coast, called Soldado de Cuera, which translates to leather-jacketed soldier. And that dressing that he's in is so thick and so heavy that it could literally stop arrows and deflect projectiles that are hurled at them. So it was like armor. So who was at the missions? The Spanish commanders, very few of those, Briones to name one, in San Francisco. The Spanish/Mexican soldier, which would be this fellow, the mission father, and of course the Native Americans who were being welcomed to be saved, to be converted in the mission system, which is that whole story, which I will not dwell on because we all know it all too well. It was the sad demise of the Ohlone in the case of the San Francisco. So here we are, the Presidio, the old Presidio. This is 1820 drawing of the Presidio. I'll dwell on it for a second longer than usual, even though that's San Francisco. It's not Half Moon Bay. I'm supposed to be talking about Half Moon Bay, but this is San Francisco. But the thing that makes it Half Moon Bay, and I mentioned this before, but I'll emphasize it more today. El Polan Strip Springs was the name of a little creek that ran out in back of the Presidio. And some of the soldiers, some of the people from the Presidio decided to build adobes outside the Presidio and live on their own. So they built a couple of houses. This was Briones himself and his family was one of those two adobes. And this fellow named Iramadas built the other one. And like to say, because it's such a wonderful factoid that probably doesn't mean a whole lot of anything in the pages of history, but the first outside the walls of the mission or outside the walls of the Presidio, inhabitants of the area of San Francisco called them the first citizens of the city of San Francisco, included this fellow named Candelario Miramadas and his pal, one of the commanders of the Presidio, Briones. And of course, it's that same Miramadas who is the founder of what we call downtown Half Moon Bay. We are on the Miramadas land grant where we stand. So he's famous the world around for being the founder of Half Moon Bay. But nobody except me, and now you, I've shared it with you, knows that he was one of, if not the first, along with Briones, citizen of what became the city of San Francisco. Come on, guys, let's have a round of applause for Miramadas. Okay, moving right along. As you know, Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, largely because Spain became disinterested to some extent. So their first great battle for independence was 1821, and all of the Mexicans basically the Mexicans that were here, the soldiers and all the heavy lifters, as well as the mission fathers, were freed from Spain, and most of the Spaniards went back to Spain, exception being a number of the mission fathers, and California became a Mexican district. And now their wealth could be expressed in terms of cattle and their own horses, and these are just a couple of, they call themselves Californios if they were born here, if they were Mexican, if they were born here after 1821, or really after whenever they got here, but it was a whole different culture from 1821 until, and that's a pretty short history, by the way, until the Americans came along. Part of that process was the land grant, so we have to talk about the land grants because the Coastside was formed by these 4 land grants, and arguably, if you define the Coastside is going on down to San Gregorio and Pescadero, more land grants. But Vasquez and Miramadas were the 2 land grant owners that certainly settled on what we think of as being Half Moon Bay. And they built their adobes on opposite sides of Pilarcitos Creek. They were neighbors. This was Palomares, Vasquez, and Miramadas had their ranches. Alviso did relatively little, and we talked before, we won't dwell on it again, but Alviso and Miramadas had a little disagreement about where the border was. Miramadas thought the border of his grant was here. Alviso thought the border of his grant was there. So this became disputed territory. And after the Americans came, and they were still trying to get their dispute settled because the Mexicans were allowed to keep their land grants if they could prove it was theirs. Since nobody could prove that disputed territory, this, by the way, is what we now call Purism Canyon for the most part, that which they couldn't prove was theirs was considered disputed, and if it was disputed, that meant they couldn't prove it, and if they couldn't prove it, the courts held that didn't belong to anybody except the United States of America. It became government property and was put up for homesteading. So ladies and gentlemen, if you look at maps of the old property holdings, which I think we do in a minute, you'll see that the properties for the land grant properties are all, when they were sold in huge big clumps, pretty much, from this creek down to that forest and that canyon and over to that hilltop. And the properties inside this disputed territory are all carefully squared away, surveyed properties into square miles, or a quarter of a square mile, known as a quarter section. And so you've got clumps of land all up and down the coast side at this time, And in that disputed area in Purissima, and any place, by the way, that's east of the land grant area, could be homesteaded, and were always cut up by very careful surveys. It might have a creek running by it, but it would have a very straight line here and a very straight line there, and most of the properties were just square. And that's why so many Americans went so quickly into the Purissima Canyon, and that ghost town was formed eventually because of that community that so many Americans could get into so easily. So the background of the ghost town of Purissima lies in that territory. Now I want to take a moment to talk about two sisters. And the two sisters I want to talk about, one of them is very famous. Juana Briones was the sister of Guadalupe Miramontes, that is to say, Candelario's wife. So Guadalupe moved into Half Moon Bay into an adobe that, as far as we know, looked pretty similar to this one, which is where Pat Roman's office is in downtown Half Moon Bay, near Mill on Main Street. Juana Briones was a remarkably self-actuated, amazing woman. They both grew up, of course, near the Presidio. That's, well, it was Mexican territory. But Juana went into business. She became a trader. As a female, she became a trader in a male-oriented society, buying and selling beef, most especially cow hides and milk to the occasional visitors to San Francisco Bay, which was Mexican at that time. And she got married to a Mexican soldier. And in this caption, which you can't read, I'll just read it really quickly. The caption says, "One of the first settlers in San Francisco," true, so was Guadalupe, the one that lived here in Half Moon Bay, the sister, managed to hold on to 4,400 acres of land even after California's changes, before, during, and after the gold rush. That sounds 4,400 acres of land for Juana. Sounds like she got a land grant. She didn't get a land grant. She bought it. It's over near Los Altos. She bought the land grant. She became a wealthy woman by trading. Her husband, the next thing says, showed her compassion and skills as a medical woman. That's also equally true. It was in the family with Guadalupe Briones. They both were healers. Juana, became a cattle rancher and merchant and businesswoman during the course of her career. And the thing that they don't mention in this memorial piece that we took down was that her husband was a drunkard and an abuser and a Mexican soldier, and was a male person, by the way, as most husbands tend to be. And she wanted out. And the idea of a Mexican woman in a Catholic culture getting a divorce in the 1840s is absolutely unheard of. And she, to make a short point, not 100% accurate, essentially got a divorce from her husband. She was probably the first women's liber and successful and powerful woman in California ever. I mean, she's just an amazing story. Well, her sister was the husband of Candelario and lived here in Half Moon Bay. So I just want to celebrate them as sisters because I was told to celebrate important people in Half Moon Bay. And I have great admiration for both of them, but really especially Juana Briones. Here's another person that I think could well represent the Californio spirit in Half Moon Bay. Is that not a classic photograph? This is Pablo Vasquez. He's the son of the Vasquez, Tiburcio Vasquez, whose adobe was just across the bridge, would be the easy way to put it. his adobe was behind Pablo Vasquez's historic house. And if you go across the Main Street Bridge and just look on your at the first house as you go across on your left-hand side, that's Pablo Vasquez's house. He is a Californio who crossed the bridge between being Californio and American. He became something of an historian in the sense that his testimony was taken by a Stanford scholar, and a lot of the information that he gave has become some of the fabric of the history that we know of that transitional period when we went essentially from being referred to as Spanish Town, which means we were mainly a Mexican community, and the word Spanish Town was not given to this community to be descriptive. It was somewhat derogatory, and that transition from 1850, let's say, until mid-1870s, in 25 years, when more and more Americans came, the Spanish Town, first of all, became descriptive, and you just lived in Spanish Town, and there was nothing derogatory or derisive about it in its later years, but eventually it got displaced by Half Moon Bay. So here's Pablo Vasquez, who was a showman. He loved racing his horses up and down Main Street. He brought all the fun of the Californio festivals and gambling and so forth to Half Moon Bay. Much of the Mexican culture was, he was kind of like what do you call, there's such a wonderful word for the person who is the ambassador of a whole culture. But we really mixed well, we Anglos and the Californios, and a good part of it was thanks to Pablo Vasquez, his horsemanship, his affection for racing down the street, for gambling, and sharing stories about old Half Moon Bay. Then came the Mexican-American War, and I'd like to point out that this is the Bear Flag Revolution flag. We're all familiar with it because all of us that grew up in California were forced to take California history, so we know that flag pretty well. And of course, an evolution of it. That, by the way, at the time, this was a grizzly bear when it was originally designed, but the people that looked at this flag, this is a photograph of the original flag. It wasn't taken in color, which is why it's got this blotchy color. But this was supposed to be a grizzly bear. We all know that, of course, that's why it was called the Bear Flag. But at the time, they wanted to replace it quickly because people that saw it thought, "What's this? The pig flag?" They thought that the artistry wasn't quite up to proper standard. Two people, and I said I have my favorite Half Moon Bay folks, Half Moon Bay pioneers, Half Moon Bay, our predecessors include two gentlemen, one by the name of Willard Buzzell and the other by the name of George Wyman. They came here long before the gold rush, came to California long before the gold rush, eventually wandered out and became part of Sutter's Fort and fur trading and so forth out there, actually went looking for gold as well. But they wound up settling right here. In fact, George Wyman, there's a house here on Main Street, which you're probably familiar with. You'll find it in your Half Moon Bay walking tour book. The house that his wife especially lived in, I'm not sure whether he was there, his wife may have moved there after he passed away, but it's right here, I'm looking out this way, that way, it's right on Johnston Street, I think, and was just recently sold. That's Wyman's house. He married somebody named America Wyman Kelsey, which is part of the Kelsey family from Kelseyville, whose family history and California history is remarkable. But he lived right here, as did Willard Buzzell, who moved to Purissima, which, not allowed to talk about Purissima, we're talking about Half Moon Bay today. So he was our neighbor, Buzzell, but they both fought in Vazell for sure, and Wyman presumably, they were great buddies, were part of the Bear Flag Revolution, which was soon put aside, and they both also fought in the Mexican-American War, being recruited by Fremont when he came through. So they're famous, famous Half Moon Bay people that really had a big piece of Half Moon Bay history. I show this picture of Stevenson's Seventh, which was a New York company of American soldiers that were sent here just as the Mexican-American War was going away. They were being sent here basically to settle California, and among their number were two people that have become pretty well known here in Half Moon Bay, namely Amesport, and Denniston. That would be Denniston Creek. Denniston cleverly married the widow of the Vasquez family. That was a good move, because that way he became one of the wealthiest people, land wealthy, in California. And Denniston, actually it was Denniston that did that. Ames is the one that did the Great Wharf, and our friend Mr. Hunter this morning was talking about that, the shipment of farm stuff by ship. Amesport, of course, was in fact, Denniston Pier was the first one, in the shadow of Joanne Simone's talked about him. That was the first pier right under the shadow of Pillar Point, and then Ames, his buddy in the Army, put up another one that became Amesport, and now our little downtown community is called Amesport. They're gold rushers, and of course 1853 is soon after the gold rush, and things really started popping here. We have Johnston's story, which we're going to hear a lot more about if we care to, and as if we're not already familiar with it, having had the tour 2 weeks ago. Was one of the first buildings. The Zabala House was also one of the first buildings, first houses. But we have to talk about the development of Half Moon Bay by talking about what was going on up at the head of not Higgins Canyon, actually it is sort of the head of Higgins Canyon, where it lopes into Purissima Canyon. All of the timber that built San Francisco was cut down basically from our canyons on over the hill into Woodside. And most of the lumber was shipped to San Francisco for building that quickly developing city, but some of it came over here, and a couple of famous names. This is a picture that was taken at the time, and the reason it's taken, I'm sure, was to say that they were basically clear-cutting our mountain sides, and almost all the redwoods that we see now in this area are second growth redwoods. And my goodness, they're still beautiful trees. Take that opportunity to wander up Purissima Canyon and enjoy that park. It's fantastic. But here to celebrate a famous person, since that's the call of the day. In 1854, we're talking basically 1 year after the first Anglos came along. In 1854, two people called Doolittle and Crumbacker built a sawmill right at the base of Purissima Canyon. They were bought out by Connolly and Lane, and then the famous ones that took over for them were Gordon and Hatch, because they became Half Moon Bay residents. And Hatch, Purissima Redwoods County Park, was called Hatch's Woods before it became a park, and that's named Hatch's Woods at the end of Purissima was named after this fellow Hatch, and of course they sold lumber for years and became very prominent people in Half Moon Bay. And how do you get famous? Is it by cutting down lumber, or is it by having a school named after you? Well, Hatch had a school named after him. Borden didn't. Hatch was a dignified, bright fellow. You can tell by his suit. Borden, I'm told, was something more of a roughneck and more the sort of person that you would think would be a lumberjack. But farming was everything for Half Moon Bay, naturally. What would attract people who had either failed in the gold fields or came too late for the gold fields or just was part of the great crush to go to California because it's free land? Yeah, Jules.
All of these years, I've always thought that the Borden Barn was named because of Borden's, the milk company.
Well, Borden did not sell milk, Jules, so thank you for joining us in this class.
At least I know where the Borden Barn came from.
There you go. I told you this could be educational.
You know, we're doing what we can here, Dave.
So, but farming is it. Everything starts with farming, and farming, as you know, farming requires land that's relatively tillable, flat. Well, much of the coast flattens out. Once again, talking geology, and we spoke about that a little last week too. But where the canyons stop, this is just so unbelievably fertile, wonderful, lush land because it used to be under the sea, it raised up. And but the canyons are a little more difficult to work with. But this was as attractive. I mean, it just goes to show, primitive culture or not, native Ohlone or American or not, the place where you went to be a diligent, hard worker and raise food was into the base of the canyons where there was water. That's where the natives lived, survived, and thrived, and it's where the farmers came and went to work. So, and the main canyon for the city of Half Moon Bay, of course, is Pilarcitos Canyon, and that's where some of the biggest dairy farms, including the one that our friend Clyde Beffa's family farmed, along with a number of others. But these were big canyons, small for the most part, small farms, because of this 160-acre limit for public land, but in some cases, huge farms, which in Beffa's case, they went from operating on relatively small farms, and as their wealth built, they built a business in Purissima Canyon on the other side of Purissima Creek, where it was in Alviso's land grant, where they were able to get thousands of acres and put them together to become really big operators, like Mr. Steele and his dairy operation in the south. So that's really the discussion that I was just having, which, boy, this thing really has a mind of its own, doesn't it? But take a look at, here is that concept of the Johnston piece was sold by Miramontes in 1853 to Johnston. So here's a huge ranch, and here's the edge of Purissima Canyon with all these, and this is outside of the Miramontes land grant. So they're all beautifully surveyed, squared away parcels, so you can tell what was homesteaded and what was bought from the Mexican land grant owners. Ann?
The Johnson land grant originally went all the way down to the ocean?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying it's not the Johnston land grant. It's
Okay.
the Johnston ranch that was bought from the Miramontes land grant.
Correct.
So make the language
Yeah.
perfected.
Yes.
But the answer is, this is just a great time for you to ask. This is their entire purchase. It was two purchases, you may remember. The Johnston's bought it in two phases. But yeah, it goes way up into the hills and all the way down to the ocean. So it was, I forgot the number of thousands of acres, but we can look it up in the books. Further study required. I just wanted to list here, out of all due fairness, I just took a quick look at a survey map from 1868, which is very soon after the Americans were pretty well established. They started coming in we could say 48, 49 with the gold rush, but practically speaking, 1850. And so I looked at, to do this table, I looked at the 1868 San Mateo County thing and looked at the various names that were names in big farming operations. So It includes, I took the biggest, Steel Vasquez was because he continued to operate a rancho, Johnston was, and Evanston was. Mill has now the park up Higgins Canyon. Hobius was the name of the fellow that owned a good chunk of what's now the golf course, was a rancher in Marsh, and Al's later in his famous dairy, which survived well into many of our time in Half Moon Bay were here when Al's dairy was working, and Lathrop and Bailey and so forth. So Nelson and Beffa, Nelson and Beffa were on, and Armande were all on the same land, and farmers were it. But what Half Moon Bay became was farmers, the community that supports the farmers with the saloons and the blacksmiths and so forth, and a little bit of tourism. Now, this is a table that I created from the 1870 census, and the reason that I say I created it is so you know that I'm not a demographer exactly by trade, so this may not be entirely accurate, but we always say this is a Portuguese town, and in 1870 the census asked, where were you born? And 1870 is a good year to look at this with, because that gave anybody that was living in Half Moon Bay, it's actually the 5th township, a little bigger than Half Moon Bay, more the coastside, and back into the hills. It asked where you were born. Well, that's 20 years of Anglo time, and I just love the answers that you could get. And we think of it as a Portuguese town, and indeed, a huge chunk of it was. 9% of the people that lived here at that time were born in Portugal. But another 9%, there's Irish Ridge up in Cresson Canyon, if you've heard of it. A good chunk of this, our population then was Irish as well. Amazingly, a good chunk was Chinese, and I'm sure they're not, in Half Moon Bay, the Chinese people all ran laundries. I mean, the cliche is valid, but they were also the massive laborers that first went to the gold fields and were chased out pretty much, and then they became the street laborers and the ones that helped with the lumbering industry. So they had a big stake in our existence. Other than the Irish, the rest of Great Britain was a huge 16%. So I love this table because I used to do marketing research, so in a sense I'm pretty close to a demographer. And I love this table because it tells so much about Half Moon Bay, or the coastside origins at that critical point where we were shifting between being entirely Mexican and entirely the mixing pot of America. And 1870, I got a hold of the census. I was able to mess with the data in my computer, and that was great fun. Yes?
Is the California wedge then from other locations of California migrating to this area?
It also includes people that were living here that were born here.
Okay, I thought.
And I would say principally, the census question is, where were you born?
Okay.
So 9% of the people were actually born here, and probably for the most part, coastside, I would guess. The balance of the U.S. can be broken down into other states, but heck, it's just fun to think that obviously there were a lot of states then. Yeah.
Is that N equals 966?
Oh, that's how many people were over 18 years of age that were in the 5th township at that time. And boy, what a wonks question. Are you a statistician, woman? Thank you for that question, Wolfie. Yeah, that's how many people were counted by that census in the 5th township. And of course, you can see with that number that it's a lot larger than just Half Moon Bay. It includes the rest of the coastside and up into the hills as well. And if I can ever figure out how to break it down to Half Moon Bay and the coastside by smaller census districts. I will because I'm a nut. I just wanted to talk briefly. Let's see how my time's doing. No, I'm still okay. I'm hanging on. Right?
Yep, you're doing good, Dave.
I wanted to say a little bit about the wreck. When we talk about maritime and naval stories being part of Half Moon Bay's history, Galen Wolfe, our local artist, we have very few nationally known artists that ever lived on the coastside. Galen Wolfe happens to be one of them. And he's a combination of a multi-talented, multimedia artist, but he also loved history. And so, as you saw if you were at Joanne Simone's thing last week, you saw that he liked to tell a story of at least two famous shipwrecks that I know of. This is kind of my favorite for a different reason. How can you have a favorite shipwreck? That's kind of macabre, isn't it? People die. But you can tell, he really tells the story in his art. He also told stories in words. Another, certainly not one on your reading list, because it's a lot of his stuff isn't so perfectly researched as the stuff that Lowe would recommend. But he told history stories. But here he tells the story. This is the Alice Buck going down. It's just off the 18th tee of the golf course, which, by the way, was Hovius's property, to talk about famous farmers. And Hovius and his son and others were part of the rescue. But here the people foundering in the water, and these could be ranchers trying to rescue, or they could be the people off the boat. But this is exactly what happened. They got torn off the boat, thrown in, tried to make it to shore. They were foundering. Some died. Some were rescued by ranchers that came by. And another, Hovius himself, took a horse in a legendary ride quickly from the golf course up to Ames Pier, because he knew that there was a combination steam and sailing ship at the pier picking up supplies to run back and forth to San Francisco. He sounded the alarm and said, "You got to get down there and help save these people." And he actually did, and that's the picture of that ship on the horizon coming in, and they did help and throw ropes to people that were there. It's a remarkable story, and well worth reading. There's an article on it. I understand articles are going to soon be published on our website. It's a fun story of heroism and daring do, and it ends in a wonderfully commercial way because it went down so close to the shore, filled with cargo, that salvagers, instead of going out on boats and trying to get the cargo up, they built basically a pier that went out to where that ship went down, and dropped divers down to pick up. It was mostly railroad equipment to pick it up. Railroad equipment was much in demand in 1881, not so much for us, but it was being shipped up to Oregon. They pulled it up, and I wrote the article, and it was such fun writing it because of the adventure of it, and I called it The Bridge to the Alice Buck. And when I wrote it, I knew what they did. They built this pier. Picture this is the golf course. Built this pier all the way out, and had gasoline-powered motors that were steam engines that would haul the stuff up out of the water and pull it all the way back here. And this photo turned up just a week ago. Somebody found it in some old archive, so I couldn't resist putting it in here. So fishing was a huge industry. I was asked if I had a famous shore whaling picture that is very popular. That hasn't been mentioned before is that it was the cover of Harper's Weekly back in the 1800s. And you guys all know about shore whaling by now, but it certainly took the place of those ships that had to go for thousands and thousands of miles to chase mad whales down out of the middle of the ocean. They just launched their little 6- and 8-man boats with harpoons off and went and brought whales in and got their blubber. I'm going to practically close on this story of the mill of Mill Street, which I have depicted with this replica of it. This is sideline. Am I allowed to take a little side detour? This is actually a model that will be found in the Zabala House's micro museum. This is a model from a diorama of Old Half Moon Bay that's in the Zabala House. Feel free to visit at any time if you haven't already. But it's our depiction of the mill that would have been at the intersection of Pilarcitos Creek and Arroyo de Leon, the other creek that feeds in here. And Pilarcitos, of course, provides us with a great deal of water, and that was the water power. And that was run by the Halstead brothers, or particularly Melvin Halstead took the lead on that. They built it in 1860. That diorama is supposed to depict Half Moon Bay the way we think it looked in 1863. So they built this, and they were using Pilarcitos Creek water to power it. But these people, George Henson of the Spring Valley Water Works, and a few years later, Herman Schussler, engineers, got to thinking that Pilarcitos Creek had so much water in San Francisco, so little water, that if they could just get the water out of Pilarcitos Creek and sending it on down to Spanish Town, instead of wasting that water on those Spanish Town people, could divert it to San Francisco by virtue of sloughs and canals and so forth, and get it to San Francisco. They could take 1 million, because San Francisco's growth at that time, 1860s, was being stunted because San Francisco is a very dry place. So these people hatched this plan of building a gigantic dam at Pilarcitos Lake, which is just up in the mountains that we go across on Route 92. And they actually built 2 dams. This is a picture of the biggest one. And dammed it all up. Well, they couldn't dam it up without offending people, so they quietly bought all the property that had water rights to it, including this mill. So Halstead sold his mill to Spring Valley, not because Spring Valley wanted to grind flour, but because Spring Valley wanted the water. And they built their dam, shut down the mill, built their dam, took the water, took it out, diverted it. Instead of going right to Half Moon Bay, they went left to what was then Crystal Springs Valley, sent the water down to Crystal Springs Valley and pumped it into San Francisco, and they proved that you could build a dam miles and miles away from a city that needs water, and you can sell it and make $1 million.
What year was that?
That was, the construction began in 1864, and it was finished shortly thereafter, but it was so successful that I consider our Halstead Mill to be the pilot project for the Hetch Hetchy Dam, because it's exactly the same principle done a few years later when we couldn't supply enough water for San Francisco. They did the same thing at Hetch Hetchy and brought it all the way across the Central Valley. And still, the dam's still there. In fact, 2 dams. Dams are still there. They're still producing water for San Francisco. And by the way, they still let Half Moon Bay have a little water. Thank heavens. So that's that was the key pivot point. That's when we became adults. 1861, we went from being a little old Spanish town and began to build and thrive, and we subdivided. Interesting that this won't go page down on me. The first subdivision was in Half Moon Bay. It was helped to be settled. It was the Miramonteses that lost the case. It was their land. Spring Valley Water Company was part of it, but a lawyer sued the Miramontes brothers, the Miramontes family, 12 people, undivided property, and won. And a story that's well worth retelling, because it's a story of unfair preying of I shouldn't say that because if relatives are still around, it's probably not fair, but it was lawyers who loaned the Mexican kids, the Miramadas kids, some money at 12% or 10% or 12% interest, saying, here, take the money, go have a ball. I said, you kidding? Yeah. Just sign this paper and go have fun. They did. And of course, some years later, the note came due and they collected and they said, well, I didn't know what I was signing. It's in English and I don't speak English. I only speak Spanish. They're saying, doesn't matter. It's a legal thing. And they said, but it's a document that I signed and I can't read and I can't write. Said it doesn't matter. You signed it. They lost. And the lawyers basically wound up with about a quarter of Miramada's property. And in order to divide it up, since it was undivided, Zavala was called upon to run the survey, hire the survey out to divide Half Moon Bay up so that this guy, the lawyer people, could get their land carved off and described. But the good thing that came out of it was that Half Moon Bay was divided. Half Moon Bay streets and blocks were all described in that 1863 survey map. So the way that Half Moon Bay now lies with its main street, it's Kelly Street, it's Mill Street, it's blocks, and everything that we in downtown Half Moon Bay live on was the product of that lawsuit and Zavala's work in getting it divided up. Zavala hired the lawyers to try to protect the Miramadis. Of course, he was unsuccessful, but he did wind up with a survey of Half Moon Bay, and we wound up with a survey of Half Moon Bay. So that's one of Zavala's contributions. The rest was that he was a shopkeeper and a livery operator. Buildings began to be built on these subdivided streets of Half Moon Bay, and the Cunha store, the Index Saloon, the Francis Brothers. I love this story. This is apparently, oh boy, that's distracting. This is apparently the Francis Brothers hamming it up for the camera in front of their store, which was in Cunha's, what's now known as Cunha's store. There's Francis Brothers, that's the inside. And in 1926, 100 years after it was built, 26 years after it was built, in 1900, Manuel, rarely known by this name in modern history, Boogie Cunha, became the owner of what's now Cunha's store. And so we had hotels by the bucket loads. We got our mills, we have blacksmith shops, we have banks, saloons. There's Boitano's store, which is fun to picture because Boitano's store was George's Toggery. There's a store in there now, I can't remember what it was, but it was built in 1873, and it's one of the few buildings in Half Moon Bay that still serves its original purpose. Still standing, still a store at about 600 Main Street. So lock that image into your head. Was P. Cottontail. Who moved into P. Cottontail's store?
Luz Luna.
Yeah, Luz Luna.
Luz Luna. Good call. We got churches. We had stagecoaches. We got somebody who was famous as a national advertiser for his side hill plow, which you've heard about before. And by the way, our museum has not one side hill plow, but two.
I will never forget carrying that with you, Dave.
It was designed for horses to pull it, but it was Low and Dave.
That moved it, yeah.
So this is R.I. Knapp. You'll hear about him if you read much of anything. Then we have the story of the Main Street Bridge being reinforced concrete and how it survived the earthquake while bricks and adobes didn't. There's Tiburcio Vasquez's adobe, 3 died. Here's De Benedetti's home and store, which wound up with him staring out of his bedroom into space, that it was replaced by, there's a picture of De Benedetti. He's a town father for sure, but that's the new building. gee, this thing's got a mind of its own and I'm going with it. I'm going to stop it here just for a second to say that the discussion this morning about the railroad, as they usually do, left off what I consider to be a vital, huge, crucial part, which is there for everybody to see, but it's rarely pointed out. All along the right-of-way for that railway, for about a mile with the railroad coming down the middle, in 1906, 1907, 1908, the early years, everybody was into land speculation, which he did mention. But what he didn't mention is that all that property, which was that wide open acreage, the way that it was in the land grants, was bought and subdivided when all you had to do to subdivide land was go to the county seat and say, I want to take my ranch and divide it into 1 million of these little blocks. And although it did no good, he was quite right in saying that there weren't very many real estate sales. Although it did no good, the fact is the subdivisions were made, including Arleta Park in back of us. The subdivisions were made, and those subdivisions remained until the post-World War II period when population did begin to boom and property did begin to sell. And when it was hard to subdivide, they were already done. So the railroad brought us the subdivisions that allowed what growth we do have in our otherwise undivided territory. The railroad also brought a lot of the most pretty buildings. Would you believe that was Half Moon Bay High School during the railroad years? There's the station. There's a model home from the railroad that was in Arleta Park.
Chronicle.
Still is.
It was and is, that's right. And there's, just for the fun of it, the last gasp of the ocean shore with these attempts, instead of running huge steam engines with lots of cars, just single gasoline-powered cars that took the modest little traffic that was left after the cars came along. And then came the infrastructure, roads beginning to be built, and Prohibition, which we've heard stories and we'll hear more, I suspect. There's Mamie Cowley and her speakeasy. Here are some neighbors of ours still to this day. They are our neighbors. They're here. They're pillars of this community. And because they expressed some hesitation to say, that's us guarding our cave full of bootleg, they said, you could use the picture, but be a little modest with the name. We'll talk about it when we want to. The pillars of this community found new living to make between the years of Prohibition, 1919 into the 30s. And this is a still, which I know where this still was, and Clive Beffa said that he had a still right where I know this still picture came from, so I may reunite him with this. This may be one of the stills he was talking about. There was the Depression here from 1940 until 42. I'm going to look at this, check my watch. I've got 5 minutes before we're supposed to adjourn. And I'm just going to say that I had the most wonderful time interviewing a lady who was a child of the Depression, who described it by saying basically, Depression, what depression in Half Moon Bay? We didn't know there was much of a depression because we all lived here and we had farms in our backyard. We had chickens and cows. My brother had to milk the cows every day, staked it out and back. We didn't have milk from our cow. We traded it off with our neighbors and got milk from their cow. Traded it off. We didn't have milk. They had milk. Shared eggs. We had lots of eggs. Abalone. No refrigeration then. Vegetables. I don't remember, but we had plenty to eat. We had plenty. On weather-baked bread, we had fish. Always had vegetables. We just didn't talk about it. So the Depression was had national impact, but because we were a farm community, just almost pure and simple during the recession, this lovely lady made it sound like such a simple thing to endure, contribute. Just so unlike the experiences in so much of the rest of the country. Half Moon Bay certainly wasn't a bad place to live then. We endured World War II. We sent our mayor to an internment camp because she was Japanese. Of course, she wasn't mayor at the time, but she grew up to be mayor. The Italians and Germans, as we mentioned in an earlier set, couldn't cross Main Street in Half Moon Bay because it got them too close to the ocean where they might signal the Japanese enemy. There's the artillery at Montara. And then in 1959, we became our own Half Moon Bay city of Half Moon Bay, and our first mayor was John L. Carter, and his family still lives here within a few hundred feet of where we are. There's Incorporation Day, and there's John L. Carter, known as Nick, in his heyday. So there's certainly a famous man. This one's Henry Dolger, who sought to subdivide the coast side. Everybody remember the Dolger name? Massive developer from, he did Broadmoor and a lot of Pacifica, and he had his eye on Montara, and then he was going to sweep south. And as luck would have it, as I mentioned the last time we were talking, Rachel Carson and the open space movement and the conservation movement came along. And there's a bitter fight that's not so bitter anymore because the no-growthers really appear to have won it, because the subdivisions are so hard to get now that Half Moon Bay had its growth arrested. It doesn't have the freeways, it doesn't have the wall-to-wall houses, and so forth. It wasn't an easy thing. Chris Hunter this morning was talking about the millions he saved us in court, but at one time, we were in the hole for $37 million because we mishandled some of that no-growth work, and the city lost a lawsuit. Skip past this, but just to show you the population of the coast side, the war, post-war, whoop, zooms up. That's what happened to us. We're a different town now. So, as I'm fond of saying, there have been many changes. Construction's been done. Roads have been built, houses and businesses, but we're still a friendly face. We're still a place where you'll have doors open for you, and we're great hosts and hosts, I hope, for our visitors. By their millions, I hope part of our museum will do that. The beauty of the sea and the beaches and the fields, they're still here. And this is kind of the closing slide to say that the community can encourage conservation, that historians like us can encourage preservation. So those are my thoughts for the day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being such a
There was one exception to that not being able to cross Main Street. You know it?
My Germans are Italians
It was the Italian baker. He was allowed to go across Main Street.
Check that story out. He was not.
He was.
Well, I want that story verified. That's great.
He was allowed to cross to bake, and then he had to go cross back over where he lived on the other side. He was only allowed to go across to bake.
I want that story verified because I've been telling it, and that's great.
Yeah.
I was telling it that that's how his son learned.